what was called the school of the new atheists. They attack religion with a great deal of flourish. They see it as the province of irrationality, even fanaticism, and they're very popular. And for believers, it's somewhat frustrating as some of their writing seems to somewhat stereotype religious practice. I'm wondering why you think, both of you can weigh in on this, why you think that this kind of writing has become so popular now, to deride religion as negative, simple-minded, destructive. Is it because they've only focused on certain aspects of religion, or do they have a case?
Other than Yiddish, I think Oxford comes up with the best insults. And therefore, if I may use an Oxford way of describing the new atheists, I would say, on the surface, they're profound. But deep down, they're superficial. There is nothing in the writings of the new atheists that was not said better by Hume, by Kant, and with infinitely more eloquence by Bertrand Russell. So my sense of déjà vu is absolutely overwhelming. Why it's happened now, I think, was best explained by the late Leo Strauss, whom I never knew, in a little book he wrote called Philosophy and Law, who pointed out that when the philosophe announced the death of religion, and religion didn't die, and they produced every conceivable reason why it wasn't true, and people were simply unmoved by this, they resorted to the last weapon of desperation, which is ridicule, which is in effect what many of these writers do. Number one, like the stuff about magic, they fail to observe the elementary rule of anthropology and sociology, which is to distinguish folk religion from normative religion. I mean, all religions have a folk penumbra, which include practices which are frowned on by the mainstream, but nonetheless happen. Number two, they lump together polemics against myth in the Bible with myth as well. I mean, Richard Dawkins, in his new book, The Magic of Creation, which in many other respects, is a super book. I mean, it's a book filled with awe. But, he takes Genesis 8, God's covenant with Noah, symbolized by the rainbow, as a kind of quasi-scientific explanation of why they're rainbows. And that's just potty. I mean, that's ridiculous. And for that, you go to Oxford, but then, it amazes me. So I think they're very angry that, having been declared brain dead in the 18th century, here is the corpse still walking and talking and breathing and smiling, and they feel they have to laugh it out of existence. But on the other hand, there is a dimension there in their case which is real and which I acknowledge in my book, The Great Partnership, which is we are seeing the return of some very, very dangerous forms of religiosity. A religionization of politics, and in certain radical religious circles. And religion and politics do not mix. When you religionize a conflict, you render it incapable of solution, because what in politics is a high virtue, in religion is the greatest vice, namely compromise. So in order to reach a political solution, you have to be able to compromise, and that means you have to make a principled separation of religion from power. And some of the religion that has emerged in the 21st century is very dangerous, very scary, and on this I would stand side by side with the new atheists in terms of my own faith. Judaism and Christianity both went through bitter internal struggles before they finally learnt to relinquish power. In the first century, the Jewish forces inside Jerusalem, as Josephus makes terrifyingly clear, were more bent on killing one another than on fighting the enemy outside. And Judaism, within the next 2 centuries, reached a stage where a 3rd century sage couldn't even understand that when King David in the book of Psalms refers to a sword, he means a sword. Hahu b'divrei Torah ketiv. You know, gird your sword upon your loins. That obviously means to a 3rd century sage, make sure you have a lot of learning to defend yourself with. And somebody comes along and says, when the line says a sword, it means a sword. And he says, oh, really? I never knew that. I never knew that before. So Judaism went through that bitter internal struggle. Christianity went through it in the 16th and 17th centuries when Europe, the face of Europe, was scarred by religious wars in the wake of the Reformation, leading to the secularization of power in the 17th century. So the new atheists, if they are referring to a dangerous development in the world, then I think they're right, and I have to stand with them on that.
No, I entirely agree with this. I'd just like to add 2 little side comments. One is, why are they so angry? Well, I think it's rather like Victorian bishops faced with Darwinism, and strangely enough, I mean, ironically enough. Why? Well, you see in the 19th century among many Christian churches the idea that Christianity is in the strongest civilization in the world. It informs it. It's going higher and higher. It will produce more and more good. Everybody will become. It's a triumphalist picture of history. And then along comes this torpedo from the side. And the same situation here. For 50 years after the Second World War, a lot of secular intellectuals thought religion's disappearing. It's all getting better. It's all going away. And suddenly it comes back. And they've got anger at having your whole expectation of history sidelined. The second thing I'd like to say is maybe what makes everybody read those books isn't the same as what makes the authors write those books. There is such a thing as a succès de scandale. I mean, people like to see what has previously been seen as highly respectable figures and institutions taken down a peg. There's a very good Canadian author you might not know very well, Nancy Houston, because she writes in French. She's gone to France and she writes in French. She wrote this brilliant book, and I've forgotten the title of it, about postmodern philosophy and how there's a deep gloom in many of these philosophies. There's no truth, there's no justice, there's no future for human beings. And people come and see plays like that and they lap them up. But in their lives, they aren't operating on the principle that there's no truth. No. But there's something fascinating about this, to see this going on, this kind of drama going on. I think that will account for a large part of the readership, because these books sell very well. It doesn't mean at all that all the buyers and readers are actually buying the argument.
There's a fascinating comment I ran across to turn atheism another way by one of the central Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, is a man named Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. And Rabbi Kook was the first chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine. He was a fascinating figure. He was a mystic. He was a remarkable figure. And he wrote an essay called The Pangs of Cleansing. And in the essay, he writes that God's being, as conceived by the multitude and even by individuals who would be their leaders, is that of a ruthless power from whom there's no escape and to whom we must necessarily be subservient. The tendency to see the divine essence as embodied in words and in letters alone is a source of embarrassment to humanity. And atheism arises as a pained outcry to liberate man from this narrow and alien pit, to raise him from the darkness of focusing on letters and words alone, to place his primary focus on the realm of morals. So it seems like that for Rabbi Kook, he sees atheism as a way of keeping religion honest and critiquing it when it descends into this kind of numbing dogma and this coercive fundamentalism. And that, in turn, would suggest that we would be better off not to draw these sharp dichotomies between what we call religious and what we call secular. I wonder if you could both reflect on the relationship between so-called religious communities and so-called secular ones.
Yeah, I think there are lots of different kinds of atheists, but I would, in particular, distinguish 2. One was nicely defined for me by the late Sir Isaiah Berlin, with whom I became quite close towards the end of his life. And the first time he came to our house, he said, "Chief Rabbi, whatever you do, don't talk to me about religion. When it comes to God, I'm tone deaf." And then he said, "What I don't understand is how you studied philosophy at Cambridge and Oxford. How is it that you believe?" And I said, "Sir Isaiah, if it helps, think of me as a lapsed heretic." Quite understand it, boy, quite understand. So there is the kind of atheist with whom I've had dialogues. I had a dialogue 2 weeks ago on the BBC, quite a long one, with Richard Dawkins. And that's how I understand Richard Dawkins. He's tone deaf to some of the not all. He has a sense of awe in the presence of nature and the vastness of the universe. But in other respects, he's tone deaf. And he said, absolutely right, I am tone deaf, which was an interesting admission on his part. So they're the tone deaf atheists. And then there are the other kind of atheists who really have soul and who really see the failings of the embodiment of religion at any given moment. And I make it my principle to have open dialogue with those atheists, and I have them all the time in Britain and in Israel. I'm thinking here of real prophetic figures who are complete atheists, very anti-religious, like the Israeli novelists Amos Oz, David Grossman, Aleph Beit Yehoshua, with all of whom I have a close friendship. I'm thinking of interesting intellectuals with whom I've had dialogues like Steven Pinker, like George Steiner. And when you're in conversation with such people, you feel incredibly enlarged because, they are seeing things from a different perspective to you, and you come away with a sense of real having made space for the other, and that's important. And that conversation is so fundamental to Judaism. I don't know of any other civilization than Judaism, all of whose canonical texts are anthologies of arguments. And if they ain't got a decent argument, it ain't Jewish, And so